IVM.
We would like to thank Storytel for sponsoring this show. Storytel is an audiobook platform that lets you hear hundreds of thousands of stories on your PC, mobile, wherever you prefer. You can get a great deal for IVM listeners at storytel.com/IVM. This week I'm going to recommend The Ivory Throne by Manu Pillai. This is a book about the history of Kerala. Manu is an incredible writer and helps you truly understand the history of the region. I first heard him talk about this book on the Filter Coffee podcast with Karthik Nagarajan, and I couldn't wait to dive into this one after I heard that conversation. So, how do you get this book? Go to storytel.com/IVM, and what you'll do is when you sign up over there, instead of $2.99, you'll get your first month for 99 rupees. So you get $200 off on your first month. Go to storytel.com/IVM and go check out The Ivory Throne by Manu Pillai. Great book.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. This is our last episode of 2020. We'll be back on Monday, the 4th of January. Now, the normal convention with one of these end of the year episodes is to do a sort of retrospective of the year that went by. But frankly, you know what dominated this last year, and you've probably had enough of it. So today, instead of doing that sort of retrospective, I'm joined by Anirudh, and we're going to do that thing we do, where we go back into the past, often into the deep past, and see if that tells us anything about our times. And today, we sort of want to go back to the very beginning of what we call civilization. I'm going to get Anirudh to talk to us about ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, which is often called the cradle of civilization. And I want to see what that civilization tells us about ourselves, and also what we owe to that civilization, because it's amazing how much of our everyday lives, how little things that we don't realize are actually directly connected to ideas that were formed in what is today Iraq several thousand years back. So Anirudh, I want you to give us an overview of ancient Mesopotamia. But before we get there, I'll ask the basic question that journalists ask: why should we care?
Thank you for asking me the question that every historian hates, Aditya. So let me first try and tell you a little bit. I don't necessarily agree with the idea that something's got to have an immediate application to the present day for us to be able to talk about it. But at least in Mesopotamia's case, it does have that immediate application to the present day because there are so many parallels to the way that urban cultures and civilizations and religions and societies all across the world emerge. In a lot of ways, Mesopotamia is really that lab where all this experimentation related to civilization happens. And once humanity kind of figures it out there, we see the same pattern repeated again and again for example, in Persia, in Greece, in Rome, and from there to all the most famous nation states of today. But one thing that I personally find all the more fascinating about Mesopotamia is because of its parallels to India, and particularly India in the quote-unquote late Vedic period. So roughly from about the 9th century BC to about the 5th, 6th century BC, where you see a number of small kingdoms starting to emerge in the Gangetic Valley, and then the gradual emergence of one single empire, and how that initial kind of political and religious experimentation that you see in the early centuries becomes the foundation of this civilization that seems to outlast all these invasions that come into that land even after. You see the exact same kind of pattern happening in Mesopotamia. So I kind of feel like talking about Mesopotamia and trying to uncover these parallels tells us a little bit about India as well. And I kind of feel like that perspective, that retrospective perspective, as it were, would be an interesting note for us to end the year on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with you completely there. History doesn't always have to have direct applications, but in the case of Mesopotamia, it's fairly evident. Can you just tell us about how civilization arose in Mesopotamia, and what are the theories for why it arose there?
So you and I have had a few debates about this, like we talked about it in our conversation about how ancient Egypt and modern totalitarianism are related. There's a whole bunch of different theories, right? So you have this chap James Scott, whose basic argument is that the state originates because there's a need for warfare, and so you have these elites who kind of set up a mechanism to extract surplus. And therefore use that surplus to go to war, and how that is basically this urge towards political control is what leads to the emergence of urban and settled populations. The book that I've recently been reading is called Babylon, Mesopotamia and the Birth of Civilization, by this chap called Paul Kriwaczek. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But he provides an interesting alternative, and he does that by focusing on what might be the oldest known city, at least in the archaeological record. This is a city, not a town, like, for example, Katalhuyuk in Turkey. This is an actual city. Its name is Eridu, and it's in the southernmost part of modern-day Iraq. It's not too far from Basra, which is this town that's on the Indian Ocean. And Eridu was basically this pretty desolate place back in the day. It was situated in the midst of these really salty marshes, next to this gigantic pure freshwater lake. And it appears that this was one of those frontier zones that are so often talked about in history, where you have different kinds of people who are kind of interacting there, right? So you would have had you would have had a small fishing settlement, for example, that would live by the shores of the lake, and you'd also have these pastoralists, these nomadic sheep and goat herding people who'd also be kind of wandering around, and every now and then seasonally perhaps interacting with the people who are living by the lake. And it seems that through the interaction of these two peoples, there were perhaps seasonal festivals related to celebrating the rights of this god of this freshwater lake. And this god is a very interesting chap. Today, he is known as Enki, or at least in Mesopotamia's heyday, he was known as Enki. But we kind of recognize his iconography because he's a creature with the upper half of a goat and the lower half of a fish, also known as Capricorn. And why Capricorn? Because from where these ancient fish-eating and goat-herding people were living, if you look directly south, you see the sun in Capricorn towards like the later half of the year, which is perhaps when they would have had these festivals. And perhaps the form of this god being half goat, half fish, reflects the fact that it originates from the interaction of these two communities. So what these communities do is, because they're living in this relatively hostile place that isn't suitable for like large populations, is that they gradually start to interact more and more. They start to settle down. Their population starts to grow, and they figure out a need for some sort of collective action in order to harness the waters of the rivers of Mesopotamia, in order to ensure that they're able to farm enough food for them all to live. And according to Paul Kriwaczek, this is really where civilization originates, is because there's a need for a collective action. And as a result of that, you start to see technology being implemented that's capable of supporting larger and larger populations.
That's interesting. And what sort of political authority exists in these civilizations? I mean, obviously there are kings, but how do these kings come to dominate, and how do they legitimate their existence as kings? Do they say that they are of divine origin, that they have a special hotline to God? What is it that makes them legitimate rulers?
Now, here's a really interesting thing, Aditya, and that is that at least in the early centuries, when cities are just starting to kick off in Mesopotamia, unlike in Egypt, you don't seem to see kings. Especially if you look at the city of Ur, which again was one of those very early cities and was basically not too far away even from Eridu, and we seem to have taken a lot of inspiration from Eridu. We see no sign of palaces, for example. You don't even see signs of mansions. Everybody seemed to be on a relatively equal plane, except, of course, for priests. So there was this really fascinating goddess in Ur. Her name was Ishtar, and she has some kind of parallels to the Hindu goddess Durga, in the sense that she's very much like a goddess of adrenaline. She is associated with, as the author puts, fighting and So she's not exactly necessarily the same as Durga. So in some senses, in some Durga legends, for example, the fact that Durga is this absolute virago, this indomitable woman whose energy, her Shakti, her sexual energy is far more powerful than that of the male gods is touched upon in some Puranic versions of a myth. But let me not get into that. Let me just come back to Ishtar. So as far as Ishtar is concerned, so the city of Ur is really dominated by Ishtar's temple. And you have essentially a priest bureaucracy that are the most important people in the city. And these chaps are basically directing the rest of the city. So you also have people who are basically doing farming and goat herding and all the other activities, maintaining canals and all that. But all of that seems to be in the service of the goddess. In a lot of ways, if you look at the gods of like early Mesopotamia, they're worshipped as gods of civilization. Particularly this Enki of Eridu that I was referring to earlier, he's described as the Lord of the Meh. And this meh is this concept that we really have no equivalent for in modern English. It really represents all the arts of civilization, as we might call it. So a quality of meh would signify that you're literate. It would signify that you know how to do agriculture. It would signify that you know how to go to war using organized bands. It would signify all these ideas of bureaucracy and civilization and religion that would have been totally new to, for example, Neolithic hunter-gatherers, but were considered to be so new and so unique by the Mesopotamians that they not only gave them a different concept, but also associated them with divinity. So really in the early stages of Mesopotamia, what you see is not necessarily this very hierarchical society directed by these warlords, but rather people who are aware that what they're doing is very new compared to what all humans have been doing before, and who therefore associate this newness with divine inspiration. And I just find that so absolutely fascinating because of its parallels to the Indus Valley. I mean, as far as we know from archaeological evidence, we don't see a lot of evidence for like extreme social stratification in Indus Valley cities. And as far as we know, the Indus people also considered themselves to be very new. There was a clear sense that this urban culture was different from everything that came before. It really makes me think about what parallels we might see if we kind of do more excavations in the Indus Valley. We know very, very little about Indus religion. We haven't discovered temples that are similar to anything that we see in Mesopotamia, at least in the early periods. And so you really have to think, in Egypt, we know that the driving force of urbanization was to a great extent wars between various warlords. We know in Mesopotamia, it was this priest bureaucracy, as it were, was something similar happening in the Indus civilization. And another really fascinating parallel between the Indus culture and Mesopotamia is that after the emergence of Ur as a great kind of urban center, all across Mesopotamia, in fact, as far away as Syria and Turkey, you start to see cities that are kind of modeling themselves on Ur. The city plan is similar to that of Ur. Even the size of the brick that they use is similar to that of Ur. Now, why is that? The older theory was that it was because Ur was going and conquering, but we know from modern archaeological evidence that they had nowhere near the kind of army that would have been needed for that kind of thing. So it seems to have been more like a religious, cultural, and economical model, a brand, as Paul Kriwaczek calls it. And this Ur brand was being adopted by all the other emerging towns and cities of Mesopotamia at that time. And once again, there's this interesting parallel to the Indus civilization, right? Because one of the greatest enigmas of the Indus civilization is that you have this remarkable conformity to this model of city planning, where you see this kind of large crossroads dividing up the city, these beautiful right-angled roads. You have systems of sewage. You have standard size of bricks that appear in this wide swathe of territory, like hundreds of kilometers across. Without a kind of very sophisticated transport and communication system, there would have been no way for an empire to kind of standardize to that extent across this vast expanse. And arguably, the Indus civilization at its peak was even larger and more populous than Mesopotamia was. So was it the case that, similar to Mesopotamia, you saw the origin of urbanism in some minor city somewhere that we don't really know, and this idea of civilization kind of spread from there and became this fad that people all across this river valley began to adopt. And we also know from the course of the Indus River today and from various archaeological evidence that the people of the Indus civilizations also did a lot of collective action in terms of building canals, there must have been some kind of bureaucracy that decided what was being cultivated, where the water was going, who was going to be responsible for cleaning up the canals, stuff like that. So it's a very interesting lens through which to think about the origins of urbanism in the Indian subcontinent as well.
It fascinates me no end to think about a time when civilization and its trappings were relatively new. I know the word civilization is now loaded, but I'll use it as a shorthand here. One of the big debates that we have about origins of civilization and their evolutions is, was it diffusion or was it some sort of indigenous innovation? Over here, there does seem to be a bit of both going on. How did these civilizations now interact with each other? Did they see themselves? Do we have any evidence that they saw themselves as being different from each other? Did they have, distinct identities? Did they find connections with each other in some ways?
Yeah, definitely. So it doesn't really take long, given the way that humans are, for this organized bureaucracy, this priest bureaucracy of Ur to kind of fall apart. And it seems to have happened because of some kind of uprising, because the system simply wasn't working anymore. And from that point, you see this explosion of like new ways of governing that seem to happen all across Mesopotamia. You have to keep in mind that even though Mesopotamia is fertile because there's two rivers and all of that, the reason why it is that fertile is because you had these systems of canals that were able to harness these rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are extremely erratic. It's not like the Nile, which we talked about again in our Egypt episode. In the Nile, you have these very regular kind of rhythms. You have this flood season, then you have the dry season, and it's a very orderly kind of society that can emerge around that. But the Tigris and the Euphrates are very erratic. At some points in the year, they will just like explode their banks and like rise to the height of a freaking 4-story building. And it's a much more chaotic sense of nature that these Mesopotamians seem to have. So they start to have these gods who are all identified with various aspects of nature. Ishtar, as I said, is this adrenaline goddess, but you also have gods such as Enlil, for example. Enlil, who basically corresponds to the atmosphere. So it's kind of funny. You think of an atmosphere god or Lord Atmosphere, and there were a whole bunch of like different cities, all of whom had their different patron god, and all of whom were fighting desperately with each other for control of water resources. And as a result of this kind of fighting that erupts between these cities after the earliest period, you start to see the emergence of kingdoms, which you alluded to in your last question, Aditya. So that's when it really starts to become something that is much more familiar to us. The much more familiar model of civilization, where you have these military men, these big men who basically, through being war leaders for their societies, eventually emerge into the status of full-blown kingship. And you see this very fascinating period, roughly around just leading up to the 2700, 2500 BC time frame or so, when all of these cities are going to war like cats and dogs. There's a very famous conflict between the cities of Umma and Lagash, for example, who literally fight a war with each other that lasts 100 years, which is absolutely insane. And like through all this period, right? So these aristocracies are trying to justify their existence by kind of saying that, look, the other people are so dangerous. If we don't fight them, then they're going to kill us. And that again is a parallel to the way that modern politicians argue, which is, if you don't give us authority, if you don't give us military power, if you don't sacrifice your sons and daughters to us, then the enemies are going to come and kill you. But at the same time, you also see towards the end of this period the emergence of this idea of legitimate and just kingship. Indian political theorists would call it Rajadharma, where you start to see these aristocrats, these kings, trying to claim legitimacy by saying, we provided justice. We took care of widows, we took care of orphans, we ensured that everybody was properly fed, therefore we deserve your support. And that again is so interesting because, like I said, Mesopotamia is very much this lab of civilization, right? So in this early period, you see a kind of a sacred site and religion-led urbanization. Then you see this military aristocracy-led legitimization. And then finally you see the emergence of what we might call a social contract even.
That is so interesting. So, you do eventually see the rise of, polities that involve some sort of royalty, perhaps palace cultures. Moving east, what parallels do we see between the evolution of civilization in Mesopotamia and beyond, and the evolution of civilization in India? Not just with the Indus civilization, but what comes much later?
So here's the thing, right? So there's this modern tendency to think of like, if something happened earlier, then it must be first, and everything else that comes afterwards is pale offshoots of it and aren't relevant at all. I think that's kind of nonsense, because as we know, eventually the Indus Valley civilization, which was this enormous like urban juggernaut of the Bronze Age, of which, as I said, we know very little, eventually collapsed. I'm not going to get into the reasoning behind why it collapsed and all that, because we don't have time for that right now. But eventually, the remnants of the Indus civilization, as well as this new culture, who call themselves the Indo-Aryans, start to kind of intermingle, and they start to move further east, right? So they start to move into the Gangetic Valley, and once again in the Gangetic Valley, you start to see urbanizing forces at play. And as far as the people of the Gangetic Valley were concerned, right, they may have had some distant memories of being part of an urban culture, but for all extents and purposes, urbanism, cities, civilizations are all essentially reinvented between the Ganga and Yamuna rivers, and like going further down, all the way down to Bihar. Which was at the time called Magadha, right? So what you see over the course of roughly the 10th, 9th, 8th centuries BC is in the Gangetic Valley, you see a lot of new cities emerging. And once again, in these cities, the parallels to Mesopotamia are so extraordinary and so striking. Where you see the emergence of Yaksha worship, for example. Yakshas are these forces of nature who are worshipped in altars. There would have been a statue for Yaksha. Each city would have had its own kind of Yaksha or multiple Yakshas associated with it who were worshipped. And at the same time, of course, you had another thread of religion from the Indo-Aryans who kind of preferred this more non-iconic, sacrificial kind of culture. And you again see the emergence of cities. You see the emergence of these military aristocracies who are all going to war with each other. And we can imagine that they probably use very similar reasoning to kind of justify their wars against each other. They would probably also have had similar bureaucracies, similar forms of collective action as what we saw in Mesopotamia to build canals and maintain irrigation and so on. Though, of course, the fact that the Ganga and Yamuna are perennial rivers and nowhere near as chaotic as the Tigris and Euphrates must have had some kind of effect on that. We really need more archaeological evidence to really tell for sure. The issue very often when it comes to this period in India is that we tend to give all our attention just to the philosophical developments of the time. And like, there's no denying the Upanishads and like other texts are like truly remarkable by any measure. But I kind of feel like that takes away the focus from all the other interesting stuff that was going on, of which the Upanishads are just really a tiny part. And once again, to clarify, I'm not saying that the Mesopotamia was the reason why India urbanized in that way. It's much more likely that the Indus Valley was the reason why India urbanized in that way. But until we know what happened in the Indus Valley period, we will not know precisely what the vectors of that influence might have been. But it is interesting to see the parallels between this very, very distant and well understood culture like the Mesopotamians and the stuff that happened in the Gangetic Valley, because I kind of feel like it speaks to something that's very fundamental to the human experience of civilization. Is that when you have larger populations and you need cities to house them, and you need bureaucracies to feed the cities, and you need political leadership to defend your city from other enemy cities, you see the same kind of patterns. You see the same religious ideas kind of emerging, the same kind of nature deities. And of course, in India as well, we see a similar concept of a social contract, the responsibility of a king to his citizens. But we'll come to that in a little bit.
Yeah, Anirudh, you did talk about how there's a lot more going on, beyond these remarkable texts. And one, common assumption is that there's basically endless warfare, especially among these, fairly small states that have fairly limited capacity to wage war, that warfare is endemic. Did states have the capacity to conduct relations with other states, other kingdoms in different ways? And we do talk often about Sargon of Akkad. How does an example like his fit into not just the history of the Middle East, but also what does it tell us about India?
So Sargon is one of those really fascinating historical figures because he is the founder of what is known as the first Akkadian Empire. And I was talking a little bit earlier about how all these military chiefs in charge of all the Sumerian and Mesopotamian city-states are all just going to war with each other. So as you can imagine, these guys just keep on fighting until there eventually emerges this guy who defeats many of the kings of many of the cities, slaughters them all, and then takes over the city called Kish. And when he takes over Kish, he is murdered as a result of a kind of court conspiracy. And this chap called Sargon emerges onto the scene. And Sargon, what he does is that he welds together all these diverse babbling city-states into a single empire, and it's one of the earliest known empires, and it's also one of the most remarkable. Because now think about this. So up till this point, all of these people, all these military men who have been ruling over the city-states were like, look, it's a question of us versus them, if you don't protect me, if you don't give me authority, I can't protect us from all of our enemies. And now what Sargon does is he, for the very first time, tries to create a new imperial identity, which transcends just one city, but instead looks to a broader imperial culture. And he tries to make himself a man not just of Kish, of Kishites for Kishites, but instead a man of all Mesopotamians, the first real emperor in that sense, and really think about what an extraordinary innovation that is for the times. We talked about the origins of civilization from the interactions of just these tiny little fishing and nomadic, goat herding communities who are building their small cities, organizing collective action, worshipping their own gods, fighting with the gods of others. And from that, you have a sudden leap to this man who says, I'm a king of all these cities, and I'm a king of all these gods, and I'm related to all these gods. And he does that in some really amazing ways. He, for example, appoints his daughter to be the chief priestess of the moon goddess in Ur. And this lady writes some really extraordinary poetry praising the moon goddess. She also, most importantly, seems to be coming up with these new public rituals where the royal family of Akkad is integral to worshipping and respecting all the gods in all the cities. Now, what is the parallel to India, you might ask? Well, think about Magadha, for example, right? So over the course of many centuries, you have like all these different just city-states come polities just going toward each other, right? So you have, Koshala, you have Vriji, you have Kashi, you have Magadha, you have Anga, you have the Mallas, you have Vatsa, Chedi, all these guys, all of them are just going to war like cats and dogs. But eventually, because of like a certain set of geopolitical factors, one region emerges as dominant, and that region is Magadha. And the reason why Magadha rises to dominance is because Magadha has access to the Chota Nagpur plateau, from which they're able to extract iron ore and also extract elephants. And they basically use this tactical innovation to overpower gradually, in quick succession, they start to overpower all the other city-states. And at the same time, we were talking a little bit earlier about yakshas and how each city would have had its own yaksha and all that. You also see the emergence of these universalizing religions in India. You see the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism, for example. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the earliest Buddhist legends, these makers of imperial Magadha, specifically Bimbisara and Ajatashatru, feature so often. Because my theory is that these kings understood very well the kind of potential that these religions would have had for justifying and kind of elevating their authority to more than purely a local level. So just like Akkad did, so you have this city called Kish, where Sargon of Akkad comes from. Kish was able to rise to geopolitical dominance because it's located close to the passes that are located at the very edge of Mesopotamia, right? So these guys were constantly fighting off nomads and so on. So they built up the military power to beat off the nomads first, and then eventually used that military power to beat all the other Mesopotamian states. Similarly, Magadha, which is basically in the hot seat of kind of dominance over the Gangetic the Gangetic Valley, learns how to fight wars and eventually kind of takes over all the other city-states. And then also you have these remarkable men like, for example, Chandragupta Maurya, who come in and who kind of try to elevate this tiny little state of Magadha into a truly imperial power. And once again, the parallels to Mesopotamia are so fascinating. So the Akkadians, for example, they build up this system of bureaucracy and of travel checkpoints between all the areas of their far-flung empire. All of us in school would have learned, for example, that Ashoka Maurya and Chandragupta Maurya built rest houses and they built mango trees. They planted them across the highways and all that. But think about why these guys are actually doing it. It's in order to make sure that they can very easily maintain communication with very, very distant empires. And just as in Mesopotamia, because you have these organized like city level models of collective action to control the rivers, for example, which kind of transition naturally into an imperial bureaucracy, you see the exact same thing happening in India. There would have been some form of military and agricultural bureaucracy that gradually becomes more and more sophisticated. And especially if you look at the earliest layers of the text, of arguably the most famous Indian text, and the text that gets me into the most trouble on all things policy, the Arthashastra very clearly shows you that India at this very early period, especially the state of Magadha, had these extraordinary bureaucracies, which we see these fascinating parallels to in Mesopotamia as well. And you have to think, how were these bureaucracies invented? You would have had to have had specialists in mining, specialists in warfare, specialists in tactics, specialists in logistics, specialists in agriculture, specialists in horse rearing and cow rearing, specialists in like welding together all these different kind of economic models of all these different polities, who are sitting and having these arguments and kind of like fleshing out like a system that can work across an entire empire, and then actually going and doing it for the first time. And in the process, right, creating arguably one of the largest and most important economic and cultural formations of their respective times. So just as the Akkadian Empire serves as the model for all the Mesopotamian empires that come afterwards, for example, the Neo-Sumerian and the Assyrian empires, similarly, the Magadhan Empire remains the model, if not in terms of organization, then definitely in terms of like economics, and definitely as a result of the kind of culture that helps create by integrating the Gangetic Valley. It serves as the inspiration for all the Indian polities that come afterwards. That is such a magnificent and such a strange parallel across so many centuries and such different cultures. And there's another point that I forgot to mention. Ashoka Maurya, right, arguably one of the most like important Indian figures, he does something very similar to Sargon of Akkad. So just as I talked about Sargon of Akkad, how his daughter went and helped create this new kind of culture which shows the Akkadian royal dynasty as part and parcel of kind of sacred lives of all these peoples. Ashoka does the exact same bloody thing. He goes and sets up these pillars and edicts in pre-existing holy sites, therefore trying to associate his own personal identity with all these sacred centers, and therefore to build for the first time this really pan-Gangetic or pan-subcontinental identity. Now, at least the pan-subcontinental thing fails, but it kind of works in the Gangetic area. But think about what is fundamentally happening here, the mechanism, and just how unique and just how new it is. And it's just so ridiculous and so strange to me that we have to examine India from the lens of a better archaeologically understood culture in order to realize these fascinating innovations that unfold in early India as well.
Anirudh, drawing a comparison between Sargon of Akkad and Magadha or Ashoka Maurya would simply never have occurred to me. So thank you for that. And this has been a really fascinating tour, not just through ancient Iraq and the ancient Middle East, but also India. What seems to be clear is that there are some parallels between how civilizations grow in different regions, the way in which polities function, rulers function, what gives them power. It's really interesting to see how the ideas around all of these things evolve. Thank you so much for this, Anirudh. I will just remind our listeners, at the most direct, most basic level, the way we arrange our weeks into 7 days, the way we divide a circle into 360 parts, our days into 24 hours and 60 minutes and 60 seconds. All of them have roots back in ancient Mesopotamia. So it does, like I said at the very beginning of this episode, affect our lives in very fundamental ways. But, they aren't just about how we divide our time. They're also about how we think about civilization itself, how we organize ourselves. The shadow of the past is something that we only grow aware of with time.
I also think that there's a broader point to be made about the way that we think of ourselves as the inheritors of a past. There is no concept of a perfectly pure and original past. There simply cannot be. This idea of the modern nation state as defined by whatever arbitrary political or religious or ethnic identity was not something that our ancestors necessarily subscribed to. If you look at the buildings that the Mauryas made in some of their most important sites, for example, if you look at their pillars, there seem to be some hints of Greek and Persian influence. And as far as the Mauryans were concerned, the fact that they were taking lessons, aesthetic, or for all that we know, perhaps even military, bureaucratic, political lessons from all these other contemporary empires, in no way lessened their appeal and no way lessened their sense of themselves as being the original and the first and the newest and the most innovative Indian empire that ever existed. And the same applies for many, many other periods. You can look at the Chalukyas in the Deccan, for example. These guys would use North Indian deities like Varaha to kind of justify their own political iconography. Like Michael Willis has written about this, if our listeners are interested. And similarly, if you look at the paintings of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, for example, in some of his paintings, you'll see European cherubs, which again are meant to clearly display him as this kind of a world-facing monarch. And of course, the example that I always keep coming back to is the Deccan Emperor Govinda III, who in his gold coins shows himself riding a horse and has the term invincible written on top of him in a kind of Arabic script. Because he was importing horses from the Arabs. So really think about what civilization really means. You have these, you do have indigenous ideas, indigenous evolutions, of course, but our ancestors never saw themselves as being anyway inferior to all the other cultures they were in contact with and taking elements from. And it is so strange today that in a world that is arguably more globalized, more culturally interconnected than has ever been, we are all the more obsessed with trying to find this pure and original and traditional past, which in many ways is a figment of imagination that kind of distracts us from the incredible grandeur and innovation and complexity of the many, many generations who bequeathed to us the world that we live in today.
You know, Anirudh, one of these days I might get into trouble by talking about how I think the Macedonians learned from the Achaemenid Persians and that the Romans in turn learned from the Macedonians about political structures. But yes,
let's hope there aren't any Slavs listening to our podcast.
Yeah. So let me just end by saying I hope this gives our listeners an opportunity to think about longer time cycles in this time of fairly catastrophic disruption of our everyday lives. It is useful, I think, to look back at the long theory of history. Thank you so much, Anirudh. Once again, I will repeat that this is our last episode of 2020. We'll be back on the 4th of January, Monday. Happy holidays to all of you, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy holidays and Happy New Year.
Please consider signing up for Takshashila's courses. Applications are now open, and you can apply at www.takshashila.org.in/courses.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Once again, just a quick reminder, please do help us out by filling out our survey. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. It really does help us figure out who's listening and, what are the characteristics that we can go and push to advertisers. That is massively helpful to us. Please, please, please do help out with that. So, on the network this week, let me start with a quick milestone. It's the 100th episode of Begin the Journey with Ashish Vidyarthi. Congratulations to Ashish and the team. Great show. If you're not listening to it, he talks to you about just how to approach life. It's just very, very cool stuff. Do check this out. I want to mention the note with Maruk Inayat. She talks about why petrol prices are so high. On the Wired Talk, Siddharth speaks with Harsh Mandar. On Advertising is Dead, Varun speaks to Kabir Biswas, the founder of Dunzo. They have a really interesting conversation about, what's the future of Dunzo and what they're thinking about. On the Traveling Professor's Diaries, check out Siddharth talk about the performance paradox. I found it really fascinating and interesting. I think that you guys will really get something out of listening to that. Please do give that a listen. And finally, let me mention Zindagi Diaries. It's Ragini Kumar's poetry podcast. The first week when it came out, we put out 5 poems first week. We put out another 5 poems this week, and the response has been phenomenal. Do check it out. It's It's in Hindi. It's a poetry podcast. Something a little different. Do give it a shot and let us know what you think. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Do you wonder what goes inside the mind of an achiever? How do they manage to get back up on their feet in spite of their failures? Do they really do something different? You're absolutely right. Yes, they do. I'm Aditya Surana. Join me every Wednesday and Friday on my show Absolutely Right, where I use my special tool of handwriting analysis, also known as graphology, to interview high performers and study secrets behind their success and personality. You can catch us on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.